In a mansion where luxury silenced simple voices, a girl quietly observed every note and every gesture. Before an audience laughing at her origins, she accepted a challenge designed to humiliate her. But what was meant to be a joke became a spectacle. She played as if translating a soul into sound. That night, the world discovered that talent doesn't ask for permission. It simply asserts itself. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The crystal chandeliers of the Westwood estate sparkled like diamonds suspended in midair, casting prismatic rainbows across the marble floors of what was arguably the most opulent mansion in all of Boston. Tonight, the estate was hosting its annual gala, an event that drew the city's most influential figures like moths to a flame. Business magnates in tailored suits mingled with celebrated artists, politicians practiced their practiced smiles, and socialites draped in jewels worth more than most people's homes laughed with calculated grace. This wasn't just a party. It was a statement of power, wealth, and untouchable privilege. At the center of it all stood the mansion's owner, a man known simply as Richard Hartwell. To the world, he was a living legend, a musical prodigy whose talent seemed almost supernatural. He could master any instrument he touched, the piano, the harp, the violin, the saxophone, each one bending to his will as if it were an extension of his own body. His performances were flawless, his technique unmatched, his reputation unassailable. Critics called him a genius. Others whispered he was arrogant, too certain of his own brilliance, too comfortable on the pedestal he'd built for himself. Tonight, Richard was in his element. He moved across the grand stage, set up in the ballroom with the confidence of a king surveying his kingdom. The audience watched, mesmerized, as he transitioned seamlessly from one instrument to another. First, the delicate strings of the harp sang under his fingers. Then the piano keys danced beneath his touch, followed by the soaring notes of the violin. Each performance was met with thunderous applause that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. But it was when he lifted the cello, his instrument of absolute mastery, that the entire room fell into reverent silence. The bow touched the strings, and something magical happened. The music that flowed from that cello seemed to reach into the very souls of everyone present. It spoke of memories long buried, of wounds never quite healed, of hopes that still flickered in the darkest corners of the heart. Grown men felt tears prick their eyes. Women clutched their champagne glasses tighter. For those few minutes, Richard Hartwell wasn't just a musician. He was a conduit for something divine. As he moved between instruments, a small figure helped him silently. She was maybe 7 or 8 years old, dressed in simple clothes that stood in stark contrast to the glittering gowns surrounding her. Her name was Sophie, and she was the daughter of one of the mansion's housekeepers, a woman named Margaret who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make nights like this possible. Sophie had learned to help her mother during these grand events, carefully carrying and collecting instruments, making herself as invisible as the staff was expected to be in this world of excess. Most of the guests didn't even notice her. To them, she was just another part of the invisible machinery that kept their comfortable lives running smoothly. A child in the shadows, unworthy of attention or acknowledgement. But that was about to change. After completing a particularly breathtaking performance on the cello, Richard stood before his captivated audience, basking in their adoration. Then, in a moment that seemed to come from nowhere, he pointed directly at Sophie, and his voice rang out across the ballroom with cruel amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone dripping with theatrical superiority, "this little girl is the daughter of one of my housekeepers. Let's make this interesting, shall we? If she can play even one song on this cello, I'll marry her mother." The ballroom erupted in laughter. It rolled through the crowd like a wave, guests nudging each other, repeating the joke, anticipating the awkward spectacle that was sure to follow. Some shook their heads at Richard's boldness. Others simply waited for the embarrassment to unfold, another entertaining moment in an evening designed for their amusement. Sophie stood perfectly still. The laughter washed over her, but she didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze, didn't shrink away. Instead, she walked forward, her small hands reaching for the cello that was nearly as tall as she was. Richard stepped back, still smiling that confident, self-assured smile, certain that this would be a harmless joke they'd all laugh about over cognac later. Sophie positioned herself, adjusted the cello between her knees, and raised the bow. The first note emerged, pure and clear, then the second, then the third, and the entire ballroom froze. The sound was perfection itself. Each note was precise, controlled, filled with an emotion that seemed impossible from someone so young. Sophie was playing one of the most technically difficult classical pieces ever written, a composition that seasoned professionals struggled with for years, but she played it as naturally as breathing, as if the music had always lived inside her and was simply finding its way out. The laughter died instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in that grand ballroom fixed on the small girl making that magnificent cello sing. Richard's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of complete shock. His hands, which had commanded instruments all evening, now hung uselessly at his sides. Sophie played on, unaware or perhaps uncaring of the storm she was creating. The music built and swelled, carrying everyone in that room through landscapes of beauty they'd never imagined. When the final note faded into silence, for a long moment nobody moved. Then the applause began. It started with one person, then spread like wildfire. Guests rose to their feet, their ovations genuine for perhaps the first time all evening. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others simply stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Richard Hartwell, the untouchable musical genius, stood frozen. Finally, he raised one hand, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying through the suddenly quiet room. "A promise is a promise," he said. "I'll keep my word." The party continued, but everything had shifted. The comfortable hierarchy of the evening had been shattered by a child nobody had bothered to see. The atmosphere in the ballroom transformed after Sophie's performance. Guests who had barely noticed her existence now clustered around Margaret, the humble housekeeper, offering congratulations and compliments about her daughter's extraordinary talent. Margaret, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, responded with the same quiet grace she brought to everything in her life. "She just loves music, that's all," she repeated, uncomfortable with the spotlight, unused to being seen as anything more than part of the furniture. Richard retreated to his private study, nursing a glass of whiskey that he didn't really taste. His mind replayed Sophie's performance over and over, each repetition cutting deeper into his carefully constructed self-image. He was supposed to be the best, the untouchable maestro whose talent placed him above ordinary mortals. Yet a child, a housekeeper's daughter no less, had just played with a skill that rivaled his own. The humiliation should have been unbearable, but what he felt was something different, something he couldn't quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first stirrings of something that looked almost like humility. As the last guests trickled out into the Boston night, Richard found himself seeking out Margaret. She was in the kitchen, helping the clean-up crew despite the late hour, her daughter asleep on a bench in the corner. Richard approached quietly, and for the first time in years, without the armor of arrogance he usually wore. "I meant what I said," he began, his voice low. "I'll honor my word. But first, I need to understand something. How did your daughter learn to play like that? I've spent my entire life mastering music, and I've rarely heard anyone play with such feeling, such technical precision." Margaret stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly. In her eyes, Richard saw a depth he'd never noticed before, layers of experience and sacrifice that suddenly made his own privileged life seem shallow. She took a breath and began to tell him Sophie's story. As a young woman, Margaret had dreamed of becoming a professional musician herself. She had the talent, the passion, the dedication, but poverty had other plans. Her family couldn't afford lessons or instruments, and when she became a single mother at 22, survival took precedence over dreams. She'd taken whatever job she could find, eventually landing a position as a housekeeper at the Westwood estate, grateful for the stability even as her musical aspirations faded into memory. But when Sophie was born, Margaret recognized the same spark in her daughter's eyes that had once burned in her own. She'd made a promise to herself that night in the hospital. Her daughter would not lose her gift to circumstances, no matter what it cost. So Margaret had sacrificed everything. She walked miles to save bus fare, putting that money toward community music lessons. She bought used instruments on payment plans that took years to complete. She worked double shifts to afford better teachers when Sophie showed exceptional promise. Every dollar Margaret earned went toward nurturing her daughter's talent, ensuring that Sophie could become what Margaret never had the chance to be. As Richard listened, something fundamental shifted inside him. He'd always viewed his own talent as proof of his superiority, a gift that elevated him above common people. He'd never considered that genius could emerge from places he'd never bothered to look, nurtured by sacrifices he'd never had to make. The realization didn't just humble him. It cracked open something in his chest that had been sealed shut for years. He thanked Margaret and left, but sleep eluded him that night. He paced his enormous bedroom, staring out at the Boston skyline, seeing it with different eyes, his vast wealth, his acclaimed performances, his celebrated status. What did any of it mean if he'd become too arrogant to recognize true artistry when it appeared in unexpected forms? 3 days later, Richard called Margaret and formally asked her to dinner. What had started as an obligation, a promise made in jest and kept from pride, became something else entirely when they sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant in the north. End. Away from the mansion, away from the roles of employer and employee, they discovered they could talk about music as equals. Margaret knew theory, technique, the histories of great composers. She spoke about music with a passion that reminded Richard why he'd fallen in love with it in the first place, before fame and ego had clouded everything. The dinners became a regular occurrence, twice a week, then 3 times. Richard found himself looking forward to these evenings with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. They discussed everything from Bach to modern jazz, from the emotional architecture of symphonies to the raw power of blues. Margaret challenged his assumptions, offered perspectives he'd never considered, and did it all with a natural elegance that had nothing to do with designer clothes or expensive jewelry. Eventually, music spilled beyond their dinners. Richard invited Margaret and Sophie to the mansion for private sessions. What began awkwardly, Richard at the piano, Margaret tentatively picking up a violin she hadn't touched in years, Sophie waiting patiently, soon transformed into something beautiful. The 3 of them began playing together, creating impromptu duets and trios in the mansion's music room. Richard, who'd spent decades performing alone, discovered the joy of musical collaboration. Margaret rediscovered the part of herself she'd buried to survive, and Sophie bloomed in the presence of 2 adults who truly understood her gift. These weekly sessions became the highlight of Richard's existence. For the first time since childhood, he experienced music not as performance or competition, but as connection, as conversation, as love made audible. But happiness in stories like these never comes without complications. The mansion's longtime security chief, a man named Frank Morrison who'd worked for Richard for 15 years, began to worry. His wife, Helen, worked in the mansion's administrative office, and she feared that if Richard's relationship with Margaret became serious, positions might be redistributed, loyalties might shift, and their comfortable employment might be threatened. Helen began planting seeds of doubt, suggesting to Frank that Margaret was manipulating Richard, that she was using her daughter's talent to climb the social ladder. If you were in Margaret's place, would you have continued pursuing this connection despite the gossip, or would you have stepped back to protect your daughter from scrutiny? Tell us in the comments. Frank Morrison didn't want to believe his wife's insinuations at first. He'd always prided himself on being fair-minded, on judging people by their character rather than their station. But Helen was persuasive, and fear has a way of making even good people do questionable things. She worked on him steadily, night after night, painting Margaret as a calculated social climber who trained her daughter to perform specifically to trap a wealthy man. The accusations were absurd, but repeated often enough. They began to take root in Frank's mind. Meanwhile, another threat emerged from a different direction. Victor Castellano, a renowned music producer who'd made millions discovering and promoting classical prodigies, had heard about Sophie's The extraordinary performance at the gala. He saw dollar signs, potential, a once-in-a-generation talent he could mold and market. Victor had worked with Richard for years, producing his albums and orchestrating his public image, and he knew exactly how to manipulate the maestro's ego. Victor arrived at the mansion unannounced one afternoon, his expensive suit and practiced smile hiding the calculation beneath. He found Richard in the music room with Margaret and Sophie, the three of them laughing over a missed note in their latest improvisation. The scene of domestic happiness immediately set off alarms in Victor's mind. Happy artists were harder to control, and Richard Hartwell had always been most productive when driven by ambition and pride rather than contentment. "Richard, my friend," Victor said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "we need to talk about your image. The word on the street is that you're getting, shall we say, domesticated, attached. That's dangerous for someone of your stature." Richard bristled. "My personal life is my own concern, Victor." "Is it, though?" Victor's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Margaret and Sophie. "The public has certain expectations of you, the untouchable genius, the solitary maestro. Start playing happy families with your housekeeper and her daughter, and people will start seeing you as ordinary. Common, is that really what you want?" The words were carefully chosen to strike at Richard's deepest insecurities. For years, his entire identity had been built on being exceptional, set apart from the masses. The suggestion that love might diminish him, might make him ordinary, touched a nerve he didn't even know was still raw. Margaret noticed the change in Richard's expression and quietly gathered Sophie, leading her daughter from the room. She'd learned long ago to make herself scarce when the wealthy discussed matters of importance. But the real complication came from an unexpected source. Vivian Ashcroft, a Boston socialite from old money and older attitudes, had been in love with Richard Hartwell for years. She'd pursued him at every gala, every charity event, every social gathering, certain that eventually he'd recognize they were meant to be together. They were the same class, the same world, the same breed. His growing attachment to a housekeeper wasn't just disappointing to Vivian. It was an insult to the natural order of things. Vivian was beautiful, connected, and ruthless when she wanted something. She began a campaign of whispers and insinuations that spread through Boston's elite social circles like wildfire. Margaret was a gold digger. The daughter's talent was exaggerated, perhaps even faked. Richard was going through a midlife crisis, slumming with the help to feel important. The rumors were cruel and calculated, designed to isolate Richard from his social circle and make continuing his relationship with Margaret socially untenable. The attacks worked on multiple fronts. Frank, already primed by his wife's fears, became increasingly cold toward Margaret at work. Other household staff, taking cues from Frank, began to treat her differently. Invitations that Richard extended to Margaret for public events were met with icy stares and barely concealed contempt from other guests. Victor continued his campaign to convince Richard that his reputation was at stake, and Vivian, sensing opportunity, made herself more available, more supportive, reminding Richard of how easy life could be if he just stayed in his lane. For the first time since their relationship began, Richard started to pull away, not dramatically, but in small ways that Margaret noticed immediately. He cancelled a dinner, claiming work obligations. He was distracted during their musical sessions, his mind clearly elsewhere. He stopped making eye contact the way he used to, as if afraid of what he might see or reveal. Margaret recognized the signs. She'd lived long enough in the world of the wealthy to know how these stories usually ended. The rich man returns to his own kind, and the working woman goes back to being invisible. She could have fought, could have demanded explanations or made scenes, but that wasn't who she was. Instead, she began to withdraw herself, protecting her heart, and more importantly, protecting Sophie from the inevitable disappointment. Sophie, perceptive beyond her years, noticed the change in both adults. "Mom, did we do something wrong?" she asked one night as Margaret tucked her into bed in their modest apartment across town. "No, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. "Sometimes people live in different worlds, and those worlds don't mix well. We had a beautiful time, and we'll always have the music. That's enough." But it wasn't enough for Sophie, who'd come to love Richard like the father she'd never had. It wasn't enough for Margaret, who'd allowed herself to hope for the first time in years. And deep down, it wasn't enough for Richard either, who found himself increasingly miserable despite doing what everyone told him was the right thing. Victor noticed Richard's unhappiness and pushed his advantage, proposing an international tour that would take the maestro away from Boston for 6 months. "Distance will help you think clearly," he advised, "and it'll be good for your career. Get back to what made you great, performing solo for audiences who worship you." Richard almost agreed. The tour contract sat on his desk for 3 days, unsigned, while he wrestled with himself. Running away had always been easier than facing complicated emotions. His whole life had been about the music, about perfection, about standing alone at the pinnacle of achievement. Why should he change that now? The answer came unexpectedly. Richard was sorting through fan mail one evening when he found a letter that had been sitting unopened for weeks. It was from a music teacher in a struggling school district, thanking him for a scholarship program he'd funded years ago and forgotten about. The teacher wrote about a student from a poor family who'd blossomed because of that opportunity, whose life had been transformed by access to quality musical education. Richard read the letter 3 times. Then he walked to his music room, sat at the piano, and really listened to the silence around him. This mansion, this life, all his achievements, they felt hollow. Margaret had reminded him why music mattered. Sophie had shown him that genius could bloom anywhere if given the chance. Together, they'd given him back something he'd lost without even realizing it was gone: his humanity, his capacity for genuine connection, his ability to be moved by something beyond his own reflection. He picked up his phone and dialed Margaret's number. When she answered, he heard the wariness in her voice, the protective wall she'd built back up. "Margaret," he said, "I've been a coward. I let other people's opinions matter more than what I know is true. I let fear of being ordinary blind me to something extraordinary. I want to make this right. Will you and Sophie come to the mansion tomorrow? I have something planned." The next evening, Richard held a private concert. He'd invited only genuine friends, people who'd supported him not for his fame, but for who he was. When Margaret and Sophie arrived, uncertain and nervous, Richard met them at the door himself. Then he led them to the stage he'd set up in the ballroom, the same space where this unlikely story had begun months ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced to the small gathering, "tonight is not about me performing for you. Tonight is about introducing you to the real artists, the people who've reminded me what music is truly for." Sophie walked onto the stage first, no longer the invisible child in the shadows, but a confident young musician who'd found her voice. The audience, already aware of her story, greeted her with warm applause. She sat at the cello, the instrument that had started everything, and began to play. This time, she chose a piece she'd composed herself, a melody that spoke of hope rising from hardship, of dreams deferred but never quite abandoned. The music was technically brilliant, but also deeply personal, and every person in that room felt it in their bones. When Sophie finished, the applause was thunderous, but she simply smiled and gestured to the side of the stage. Margaret emerged, and for a moment she looked terrified. She hadn't performed publicly since she was a teenager, and the years of working multiple jobs had left her hands rough and her confidence shaken. But Sophie's encouraging nod and Richard's supportive presence gave her strength. Margaret picked up the violin, the instrument she'd once loved more than anything except her daughter. Her first notes were tentative, uncertain, but as muscle memory kicked in and passion overrode fear, something remarkable happened. The years of sacrifice, of putting others first, of burying her own dreams, all of it poured out through the violin in a performance that was raw, honest, and absolutely captivating. She played like someone who'd been holding their breath for decades and was finally allowed to exhale. The audience was transfixed. These weren't professional musicians performing rehearsed pieces for admiration. These were real people sharing real stories through music, and the authenticity was more powerful than any technical perfection could be. When Margaret's piece ended, she looked up to find tears on many faces. But the evening wasn't over. Richard walked onto the stage, and for the first time in his illustrious career, he looked genuinely humble. He sat at the piano, positioned between Sophie's cello and Margaret's violin, and smiled at both of them. For most of my life, he said to the audience, I believed that musical genius was about individual brilliance, about standing alone at the top. These two incredible people have taught me that real music, the kind that changes lives, is about connection, about shared humanity, about recognizing beauty wherever it appears. I won't be performing alone anymore. The music that changed my life is right here beside me. What followed was a trio performance that none of the witnesses would ever forget. Richard, Margaret, and Sophie played together with a synchronicity that seemed almost telepathic. They wove their instruments around each other, creating harmonies that were greater than the sum of their parts. Richard's technical mastery met Margaret's emotional depth and Sophie's pure, unfiltered talent, and the result was transcendent. When the final note faded, the audience rose as one. The ovation lasted for several minutes, people cheering not just for the performance, but for what it represented, the triumph of authenticity over pretense, of love over convention, of seeing people for who they truly are rather than where they come from. Frank Morrison was in the audience that night. Helen had refused to attend, but Frank had come alone, compelled by something he couldn't name. As he watched Richard look at Margaret and Sophie with obvious love and respect, Frank felt ashamed of the doubts he'd entertained, the whispers he'd half believed. After the performance, he sought out Richard and offered a genuine apology, admitting how his own fears had clouded his judgment. Richard accepted graciously, understanding how easy it is to let fear override compassion. He'd done the same thing himself just weeks earlier. Victor Castellano left the concert early, recognizing that he'd lost his influence over Richard. The maestro had found something Victor could never offer, fulfillment that came from connection rather than competition. The unsigned tour contract was thrown away that night. Vivian Ashcroft attended but left in silence, finally accepting that some bonds couldn't be broken by social pressure or strategic manipulation. Richard had made his choice, and it wasn't her. In the weeks that followed, Richard made his commitment official. He proposed to Margaret, not at some elaborate public event, but in the music room where they'd first discovered their connection, with Sophie as their witness. The wedding was simple but elegant, held in a garden on the estate, attended by people who genuinely cared, rather than those seeking social advantage. Richard legally adopted Sophie, giving her his name and, more importantly, his unwavering support for her musical education. He established a foundation in Margaret's name, providing scholarships to talented young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds, ensuring that other children like Sophie wouldn't have their gifts stifled by poverty. The three of them began performing together professionally, not as a novelty act but as a genuine musical family. Their concerts became known not just for technical excellence, but for emotional honesty, for the visible love and respect they showed each other on stage. Critics wrote that Richard Hartwell had finally achieved true greatness, not by standing alone, but by learning to stand together. Margaret bloomed in ways she'd never imagined possible. She became co-director of the foundation, using her own experiences to identify and nurture hidden talent in unexpected places. She also resumed her own musical career, performing regularly and proving that dreams deferred aren't always dreams destroyed. Sophie grew up in an environment that celebrated her gift, while also ensuring she remained grounded. She understood, because her mother made sure she understood, that talent was precious, but kindness was essential. That achievement meant nothing without compassion. That privilege carried the responsibility to lift others up. Years later, when journalists asked Richard about that night at the gala when everything changed, he always said the same thing. I was a good musician who thought he was great. Sophie and Margaret taught me the difference between technical skill and true artistry, between performing for applause and playing from the heart. They didn't just change my music, they changed my life. And whenever Sophie was asked about her remarkable journey from invisible servant's daughter to celebrated musician, she would smile and say, "My mother gave me everything. She sacrificed her own dreams so I could live mine. All I did was play the cello. She's the real artist in our family." Margaret would shake her head at such statements, but her eyes would shine with pride and love, grateful not just for the life they'd built, but for the courage it had taken to claim it, to refuse to remain invisible, to believe that talent and worth existed independent of wealth and status. The Hartwell family became a living testament to the idea that families are built not just through blood, but through choice, respect, and love. That genius exists in unexpected places, waiting only for someone to notice and nurture it. That the barriers we build between people, based on class and circumstance, are artificial constructs that crumble when confronted with genuine human connection. Their story spread far beyond Boston, inspiring others to look beyond surfaces, to recognize worth in places society taught them to ignore, to understand that sometimes the most profound gifts come wrapped in the humblest packages. And every time they performed together, whether in grand concert halls or intimate settings, the audience could feel it. This wasn't just music. This was a family that had found each other against all odds, that had chosen love over convention, authenticity over appearance, connection over isolation. This was proof that the most beautiful harmonies often come from the most unexpected combinations. Dear listeners, we hope Richard, Margaret, and Sophie's story touched your heart. If you were moved, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you most. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.